Welcome everybody, welcome community to this digital meetup today. Product analytics in IoT with the CEO of Kraftful, Yana Welinder. Before we would like to hand over the microphone and screen sharing to her, let me give you a brief introduction about myself so you know who is currently talking. My name is Alex. I'm a senior PM with product people since, I think it's now 8 months. I have 8 years in product management background, was a software developer in the past, and also had a startup, a yet failed startup also on my CV. I worked in the past with companies like the World Health Organization, HeyJobs, which is a big HR tech in Germany, or Clara, the health tech. Also worked for Emma Sleep on a smart mattress, which is why I'm very curious about this talk, and nebenan a social network in Germany. That is about me, and I would love to briefly also cover what we do as product people. Our mission is to help companies discover and deliver great products faster. And what that means is we empower our product management community to share knowledge generously, whilst managing also these hands-on work. Some people call it unglamorous. I really call it like this is the basis why we exist as product managers on an interim basis for like 3 months, 12 to 12 or even longer, depending on the needs. We onboard to achieve that super fast. We align with the teams we work with, and we deliver outcomes. As for now, we are also 12,000 members on various communities, the biggest one on LinkedIn. To get to know you as a community who participate today, we will, in a second, have a survey running on Zoom with some questions. For all the other people on other platforms, you can answer these questions, which I will read out in a second, in the comment section, for example, in YouTube. So I'm seeing that the questions were delivered to you. Let me read them out briefly. The first one is, have you ever used an IoT product like a smart home appliance, connected fitness devices, wearables, or other internet-connected hardware like fridges or a vacuum cleaner? Yeah, simple yes, no. And the second question, there we go into more detail. What do you think matters most in an IoT product? Right, the reliable connectivity, the compelling use case, the ease of use, the interoperability, or even other things matter to you. Please share that in the comment section. I'm looking also into these chats for your answers. I will also, by the way, answer these questions, and Mansoor will soonish reveal then your answers, and we could dive a little bit into it. I'm already seeing one answer here, but now I got overturned. So 100% of you use IoT products. I actually didn't expect anything less. I think you're all very tech savvy and you're interested in this talk. In terms of the second question, like what matters most to you, we have basically a split on 3 answers: reliable connectivity, compelling use case, and the ease of use. The interoperability got no votes. That's interesting. That's very interesting. And I think Yana will maybe touch on this one, as it is quite important. In the chats, I see also answers on B here, compelling use case, and see ease of use as well in the chat. Just waiting 2 more seconds for other answers coming in. I see people on LinkedIn quite active on answers. Yeah, ease of use is really the biggest here. So answer C. All right, Yana, you got to know a little bit the audience, the background, what they think matters most. With that being said, I would love to hand over to you right now. We'll stop screen sharing. If you have slides, take over screen sharing and also unmute yourself. Thank you very much again for joining today.
Great. I assume you guys can now see my slides.
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Perfect. All right. So I'm really excited to join Product People today. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Yana Welinder, CEO, co-founder of Kraftful. We provide UX analytics for connected hardware to make everything that is becoming connected, usable, and therefore useful to everyone. So I was happy to see that ease of use was a big winner in the poll. Our customers include makers of smart home products like thermostats or air quality devices, connected cooking appliances, connected fitness and wearables, other types of connected devices that are either controlled via an app or has some sort of display on the device, sort of like, you can think of it kind of like the Peloton behind me has a display, right, on top of the hardware. We are backed by Y Combinator, Google, and Samsung, and our founding team came from companies like Slack, Facebook, Apple, to bring the data approach behind massively adopted software to the world of IoT. And specifically what we're addressing is this is the problem, right? Like everything around us is becoming connected. And surprisingly, the apps that control a lot of the new connected hardware don't rely on interaction data to improve the experience and make it easier to use, which explains why so many of them, particularly smart home products, are really difficult to use. So I want to do a quick overview on me, how I got here and how I essentially uncovered this problem. I started my tech career at the Wikimedia Foundation, the company that provides Wikipedia. But then I left the comfortable space of pure software to join an early stage, fast growing unicorn, building hardware, software, and actually also our own materials in a bid to revolutionize how everything is designed and manufactured. At Carbon, I was the second PM. And I learned why they say that hardware is hard, and I learned how resources get distributed differently when you have something that is that capital intensive as part of your expenses. And my experience at Carbon made it very easy for me to be able to empathize with connected hardware companies when I later became head of product at IFT. If you're not familiar with IFT's claim to fame, other than, as you can see, having way too many silent T's in the name, is that it's making different IoT products like Nest and Ring interoperable. So working with lots of IoT companies there, I learned that hardware companies either never thought to use product analytics to optimize the user experience, or they use it like a gym membership. They pay a lot of money for it. They spend months getting everything set up, sort of like buying fancy gym clothes. And then they feel a little guilty for never actually using it. That's when I realized that there's a need for a solution that will help IoT companies optimize their usability based on data. I would hear from IoT PMs that even when they sell millions of a connected device with a recognizable brand, so people will buy it, only a few thousand people will actually connect the device via the app. And so naturally, being a PM, I wanted to help them get to the root of the problem. So I would try to figure out like how many people try to connect the device, how far did they get, which connected features users care about the most, are those features easily discoverable? And I was surprised that hardware companies really big and small, couldn't answer those questions. And it turned out that hardly any of them used analytics tools because those tools require a ton of configuration. And IoT PMs have more than just software and user experience on their plates, right? They're building hardware, which is hard and expensive. They build software, which includes firmware updates, much harder actually than just the general software that we do in the software world. They also do things like manage supply chain issues, work on chipset shortages. When AWS has an outage, that's bad for everyone, but for certain companies, their users get locked out of their homes. So it's really, really painful. So they don't have time to learn data science jargon to navigate general purpose analytics tools and figure out all the different metrics that matter for IoT products, and then configure charts, funnels, and Rube Goldberg machines. If they do use anything, they usually use Google Analytics because it's a pre-configured dashboard. But if they want to answer a specific, IoT-specific question, like where do users get stuck when they try to connect their device, PMs need to export that data and query it outside of Google Analytics, which most of them don't really know how to do. And even if they do, they don't really have the time to do that. So ultimately, they end up shipping software as if it's hardware. They develop it once, they ship it, move on to planning the next product, which is particularly true for companies that traditionally have made non-connected hardware rather than sort of the digital first IoT startups. So the hope is that, if we can get them really easy access to good analytics, that will make them pay attention to where people struggle with existing user experience and improve it before they start focusing on the next product. One thing I want to kind of mention here is that kind of as an aside, my guess is that this is true outside of connected hardware as well. Kind of like as software is eating the world, everything is becoming powered by software. I wouldn't be surprised if software development best practices don't really get adopted evenly across all industries. So there's probably a need for something like Kraftful type solution in other industries as well. I often get asked, questions about how do you look for a good product? How do you look for like a good startup idea? I think like when there is a big shift in an industry like that, it usually produces gaps that could be addressed by a product or a business. So what are, I guess, some of the metrics that are critical for a good connected hardware experience? And I think, for any kind of product, optimizing the first user experience is always critical, partly because it's the first thing that users see, but partly also because if they haven't used the product before, that's when they're fresh, they haven't learned anything. So it's a good sign of the usability of the product, generally speaking. For connected hardware, it's particularly important because if a user can't onboard and properly connect the device, they will either end up using the device as a dumb device and hate the fact that they paid for the price of a connected device without getting any benefit of the connectivity, or some devices can't be used as a dumb device if it's a connected device, and so then they will have no choice but to return the product. On the other side, if they can figure out how to onboard the device, connected hardware tends to be a little bit stickier than pure software, particularly if it's a home appliance in your home or a fitness device where people get hooked hormonally, which is pretty powerful. So our pre-configured IoT dashboard identifies kind of the key milestones that a connected hardware user takes across different types of connected devices, right? Signing into the application for the first time, connecting the device, taking some action, ultimately coming back. And we help you spot where there's a significant drop-off, even at that highest level, and then provide usability recommendations for how to eliminate that drop-off, or at least reduce that drop-off at that point. The connection success rate is part of that first user experience, but then depending on the type of connectivity of the device, users may need to reconnect the device pretty frequently, particularly if it's a Bluetooth device. That's just part of how it works. So making that connection really smooth becomes a critical part of the connected experience. So we help companies track their happy path connection success, their absolute connection success, and then compare it to industry benchmarks to understand where they have particular room for improvement. Another kind of interesting metric is around session duration. It's particularly interesting for connected hardware because it's somewhat different from what you would normally care about. For most other types of apps, think of like mobile gaming or social media, you're usually optimizing eyeball time. So you want people to spend a lot of time in the product. The more, the better, right? If you have a user that spends an hour in an app trying to figure out how to turn on their lights, chances are they're thinking about how to return that product, right? So you want users to quickly find the feature they're looking for, use it, and then feel comfortable coming back again next time to complete the same task in the app. So there is sort of an optimal average session duration, and our dashboard helps PMs identify their baseline, understand how that compares to the industry, and then track deviations over time. One way to optimize session duration and make sure that you do get to that optimal session duration is by presenting features in intuitive places. So there's usually an optimal screen and an optimal place on that screen for each feature. And the way you discover it is by analyzing the role of the feature, of course, but also studying how users then interact with it. So to give you an example, if you have change schedule here and change mode, and they're similar looking features. They live side by side on the same screen, and yet you see this interaction where users are interacting with change schedule so much more than change mode. That's an indication that it's not a feature that should, change mode is not a feature that should be that prominent. So you would want to move that to a less prominent place in the application. And then because change schedule is now not getting, doesn't have to compete with change mode, you should see change schedule go up. And obviously you should see change mode go down because it's now not as prominently presented, but you want to make sure it didn't completely disappear, right? Because then you hit it too well in the product. I actually, we can probably talk to some other metrics probably later in the Q&A, but I want to make sure I address any kind of specific questions that folks have. So would love to open it up to the audience at this point.
Yeah, we can already go there. If you want to stop sharing your screen? All right. Thank you, Yana, for the presentation so far. Let me repeat my screen sharing here. Just a short second. So to give everyone the chance to basically ask the questions, please formulate them, throw them into the comment section in the platform you're in. If you are here in Zoom, you can already also put that in the chat in Zoom. Or if you want to speak up, you can also raise your hand in Zoom, and we will gladly select you for that question. So that you can basically formulate your question. Just give you a very brief overview about the use cases. Aka, when to engage us at Product People, we have basically 3 use cases. Want to see common interim product management or product leader role. So we cover firm positions while you're hiring between like 3 or 9 months. Reasons for this could be parental leave, someone left, or a longer sabbatical. We have the product coaching consultancy here as well. If you want to coach your product management team on various levels, we can do this as well, and create and streamline processes from 0 to 1 or even at large scale. And the last use case is the product discovery lead. As more people adopting now continuous discovery habits or the opportunity solution tree, we are also there to help you to identify the market, establish user research and business models. Or if you want to run a low or no code pilot or MVP, we are also there to help with your team to discover, ideate, and run a kickoff that. We already did this and are currently doing this at Zalando, WeShare, Scout Group, and Tier Mobility as well. And because we are at these clients really much as full-time employees, we are acting not really as hands-off consultants, really hands-on. We receive numerous positive feedback. And if you want to be one of these people at Product People to work with the clients, here you see a lot of happy faces. You see all diverse backgrounds from over the world. There's also a tiny yellow ball on the right side. So if you want to be part, feel free to apply as a product manager of all levels, associate, regular, senior, and above at productpeople.join.com. I'm happy to receive your applications. We have numerous positions out on LinkedIn if you want to check that out. And now we are going to the Q&As. Finally, let me check in here in Zoom if we have basically risen hands or even chat messages. So, and yeah, I see. Let me also, the benefit of being the host here today. Yeah, I have one question to you. It's like, also in Node, because you said in the beginning that for IoT, tracking analytics may be hard, may be forgotten, etc. And you said like that might be even relevant also for pure software products, which is true because we often forget what's the success metric of a specific new feature or iteration. And then because we don't define it, we also don't think about tracking, and then basically we track nothing and we launch without it. But you would say it's even harder for a hardware product to fix that, right? If it's out in the world, an OTA update, etc., this can this be a killer for a whole product line, or how easy is this fixable? What do you think?
Yeah, I would say it's very actually easily fixable in that for most type of connected hardware, users are usually interacting with the hardware via a display or a mobile app. So it really becomes just like doing a software update to get the analytics out. Not quite as simple when it's the display itself, but usually you can ideally you don't want to launch a product without having the tracking there from the start. But the reality is that it gets deprioritized often, and you want to get something out, and you forget, which is even as you launch a feature in a product that has extensive analytics already included, and then you want to get a feature out quickly. Chances are that feature also doesn't get tracked sometimes. But yeah, adding analytics after the fact is not necessarily a problem. It's just that for most part, I would say the reason that doesn't happen is that teams don't really use the analytics at all, right? Like in the hardware space, even if you did track the metrics or track the data, product teams aren't using the data because they have no easy way at understanding it or analyzing it or getting it in a helpful format.
Mm-hmm. Just to follow up on this, thank you so far. Is it because of that? If you think about IoT, it's basically in the stores, Amazon, everywhere. So it's just basically about how many of these items being sold on the markets, and nobody cares then later on what happens with the products.
I think it really depends on the type of company you're looking at. If you're looking at one of these kind of older established hardware companies, they have traditionally shipped hardware once, and then they would have to wait until they ship the next product to make changes to it. So they would collect feedback from users primarily through customer service, and that would inform the next product, and they would do market research and other kinds of analysis. And so this idea that you can get data from users immediately the moment you ship it out into the world, and you can use that data to then improve the product, it hasn't been part of the DNA. So I think that's one type of issue is with hardware companies that have traditionally made non-connected hardware. With hardware companies that are kind of this digital first, new startups that are coming into the world that didn't used to do traditional hardware, they're just starting out. Their challenge is that they have so many different things that they need to do from scratch, right? Like they need to develop the hardware, which it's much harder than it is for software startups to figure out the whole logistics around that. They also need to develop the software. They usually have still limited resources the way startups do, and so they're trying to figure out which of all of these things do I do. And so ultimately, the question is, you can't skip the hardware. Customers would notice. You can't skip the app itself. Customers again would notice. But analytics, no one would really notice if you didn't have that, right? They will notice in another way, but that's it's just secondary at that point. So I think you're just trimming as much things that aren't critical in that moment, and it feels like you're doing the right thing, but ultimately you may never come back to it, and you may never add analytics. And that's really where the problem comes in, is that the experience, you launch the product, but then you are actually launching software, and software normally improves based on interaction data, but this software does not, right? And so you're not constantly trying to figure out how do you make this product better for users.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks for the answer. I'm going here now to questions from participants. So we have a question here from Zach. What do you find as the biggest oversight for most IoT products when it comes to UX?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of different issues. One type of issue is around that first user experience. That's why we make that front and center in our dashboard, is to track the first user experience, because IoT companies, IoT experiences oftentimes will try to get as much as possible into that first user experience, which makes it really difficult for users to onboard. So they will, like, to make it more concrete, you set up a connected device, and they will think about, okay, this product has been sitting on the shelf for a long time, so it will probably need to do a firmware update. You're connecting the device, so this is a really good time to make sure you do that firmware update. So now you do a firmware update for 10 minutes, right? Then it's a connected device that goes into your home. They're like, okay, well, you'll have other connected devices in your home, so it's important that you name this device versus other devices, so it's easy for you to spot them. And then they're thinking, okay, eventually you're going to group this device with other devices, so you better create a room in the application where you say where this device is going to go, so you later can control whole rooms. So there's like all of these different things, and ultimately you're connecting a device, and it takes forever, because you're doing the firmware update, you're naming the device, you're creating a room, you're doing all these different things, and something goes wrong, and the user drops off. And there's so many different ways in which the user could drop off. I would say that's the number one problem, because ultimately, really, what you would want to do is to make sure that first time user uses the product, they can get to first time they open the app until the first time they get some benefit from the product as quickly as possible, so that they don't drop off, and so that they feel like, okay, this product has some benefit, before you get them investing lots of time and doing all of that different types of configuration. I would say that's one of the kind of the biggest problems we've seen, mostly because it's so impactful, right? If you don't get that first user onboarded quickly, they're going to return the product. Lots of other examples too.
Thank you. I will pick you soonish, George. I just have a follow-up question from the previous person. With IoT having the ability to have so many options for customizability, do you think having those options are good? Or is it best not to show these more advanced options? So simplicity versus being rich as an application.
Yeah, I think it's a balance, because right now most connected hardware users are still early adopters. Early adopters love knobs and configuration, so you can't really ignore those users, while you still need to make the user experience so simple that you can start getting more mainstream users onboarded as well. So I would say, you just want to make sure that you present features in a way that takes into account that these are basically different audiences. The things that you want to have front and center are those super simple, most commonly used features. And then you still want to make sure that the power users can find all of the complex configuration that they would be looking for, most likely in the settings, right? Like, power users love to go on a hunt. It's not a problem to have them looking. In fact, they will feel better about having found something most people don't know, right? You don't want to hide it completely, but you don't need to place those features on the home screen. I think that's actually something that a lot of companies do wrong, is because they don't have data on how users use the product, so they use it themselves, and they feel like this particular configuration is really important because I use it all the time, and so they place that on the home screen, and then they ask the other the engineers, the technical folks on the team, like, what features do you like? And so then you get a home screen full of stuff that makes it impossible to find the really common features or commonly used features, whereas all of those complex knobs should really have been in other places of the experience.
Thank you. Makes sense. George, thanks for your patience. Go ahead, unmute yourself if you want to ask that question verbally.
Yes. Hello. Thanks, Alex. By the way, is it Yana, your name? Call you like that? Okay. Many thanks for the presentation. You're trying to solve, or you're helping others trying to solve a very important problem, I would say. And my question is mainly, since you have more exposure to this market, do you feel that it's a lack of these companies of perhaps of proper usability testing or having a strong quality assurance team to, to go through all of these scenarios? Or is it that companies already know that people are going to not have a very good experience and they are based just on the power users? Because sometimes it feels to me, sorry, I just need to close one phone here, and just feels to me that extra hardware is needed and raises the cost, just because usually in a home situation, the Wi-Fi router was meant for devices to have like a proper UI interface to connect to it, and now all of these lamps that I have at home, they can get disconnected, and I don't bother connecting them again, for example, because it's difficult. What do you feel it's more from these two? If you understand the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it definitely would be helpful to have more QA processes and usability research. I would say that all of this work that would be done ahead of launching a product only gets you so far, because if you do usability research, oftentimes you're looking at users in sort of like almost like a lab environment. Even if they're not like physically in a lab, they still know that they're doing something while being watched, or they know that they've gotten some instruction, which is basically open up your phone and do this thing. So now you're primed to read instructions, even if they come slightly later, right? And we know that real users don't read anything at all. So in the real world, users are going to behave very differently from how they would behave in a usability study. Similarly, if you're doing things like surveys, that's an even further step removed from how users would actually interact with the product, because they're answering questions in the abstract, which is what people say is very different from what people do. So I would say that perhaps it would be helpful to have a little bit more of that, but actually that kind of research does happen a little bit more than you would think. The problem is that once the product is shipped, there isn't as much attention to how users are interacting with the product and where they get stuck. So I would say that that's the biggest missing piece is looking at where are users actually getting stuck when they're interacting with something in their home, like what about connecting your light bulbs is particularly painful to you and other users, right? As opposed to looking at trying to discover that ahead of time with just the usability research that you can do there. And there's a good chunk of connected light bulbs, just because that's the example you brought up, and that's an interesting one, because unlike a lot of other products, there you have the hardware. It has absolutely no interaction. There is no display on the light bulb, and you just have the lamp, and then you have the light bulb, and there's multiple of them. Many of them blink to tell you, I'm a disconnected light bulb, reconnect me, right? And that's a terrible user experience, right? Like if your light bulb gets disconnected and you don't have time to reconnect it, it becomes completely useless, because now it blinks whenever time you turn it on. So I think there's a lot of not looking behind after, what happens with users once they start using your product in their homes, that's going on at these companies, that I think needs to happen much more. And they would discover that actually there's so many specific things that you could solve for users and make the experience much more delightful than it is.
Okay, many thanks for your answer. I mean, the follow-up is like, just a quick one is if extra hardware, if you have found that they just cannot provide because they need it's difficult for them costly wise, they need extra hardware to make the experience anyway be fluent, or you have not had this experience at all from customers. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think there's a need for extra hardware. I really think it's a software problem that for most part, right? Like I think the other thing that we're seeing is frankly, there's a lot of connected products right now that aren't particularly compelling use cases yet. And that's not, and it's only because we're at the very beginning of this journey, right? People are still figuring out, how do I use connectivity in a really compelling way where my product is actually going to solve the connectivity is going to solve real problems for people, as opposed to just putting connectivity in a piece of hardware. So I think that's the other piece, is sort of like figuring out which products are actually useful as a connected device. Over time, I think we're going to see some really great use cases. We're already starting to see some really great use cases, but some are just not that compelling yet. But I think over time, folks will figure out what are all the ways in which you can use IoT in helpful ways. So we're sort of like at the beginning of this kind of like where the internet was in the early days before folks figured out like e-commerce and various types of applications.
Thanks,
Great question.
George.
Thank you.
Thanks, George, for your question. I'm going over to a question from YouTube here, from Carlos. Compared to Europe, I guess that you are based in the US right now, so you can maybe answer this question. I guess that in the US, we see a quite paternalistic culture. Everything needs to be well taught and explained, which impacts all kinds of self-learning experiences. The question is here, how do you see that affects user experiences? How does that relate to the digital literacy?
Yeah, I think I actually find this come up pretty frequently. I was at a conference last week, and it was on a couple of panels, and on one of the panel, user education was a really big one. Like we need to educate users and in use of connected hardware. My take on it is that a user doesn't need to be educated. Like if you're educating, a user has spent lots of money on their piece of connected hardware, and it needs to work intuitively. If you have lots of education of the user, that means that the product doesn't work well, right? Like help centers, various kind of manuals or that kind of stuff. Like users don't read, and they should not read. The experience should be intuitive, and you need to figure out how do you not present so many features to users so that when they look at the features, it's actually the thing they were looking for, and they know what it is because it has one label. And it's an icon, and icons are not universally known. But if they do recognize the icon, they know that this feature does what they think it is. If they don't recognize the icon, there's also a label that they can fall back on. And there isn't like 10 other things that is cluttering their view so that they can't really consume that information. So I think there's so much education that would be unnecessary if the experience was thoughtfully designed based on data from how users actually use the product. So, I would say, maybe I agree with the European view on that. I am European, so maybe that's not so surprising. But yeah, I don't think users need to be educated. I think users need to be delighted with something that actually works the way they expected it to.
Thank you very much. I have a question, basically, since a couple of minutes in my head, I need to get out. It's basically, it's a lot to do about IoT and sustainability, right? The more IT devices, the software combined to it, we throw that stuff away after 2 years. That is not great. How can Kraftful maybe have an impact on that topic by, I don't know, measuring the lifespan of certain connected IT devices? Is this something you think about, talk about internally?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think a lot of the reasons, I think a lot of connected products right now are getting sunset too early because they don't perform the way the folks hoped that they would perform. So by making products usable and useful to customers, we can prolong their life cycle or their existence and not have them go out of, not have to have devices sunset, or the support for those devices sunset, I should say. Usually, you know, the devices are still in people's homes and they have to figure out what to do with them then. I think that's one. The other is, I do think that there is something interesting to be thought through. This goes back to a little bit to my point about, you know, useful connectivity and how we make sure that products are actually really useful, but also how do we design them in a way that makes sense. For example, if you look at some of those smart fridges, right, with that have basically an Android display embedded into the smart fridge. I'm guessing the idea at this point is that when this Android display, and how often, if we have a tablet, usually we replace it pretty quickly, right? A fridge is something you've had in your home for many years, right? That usually has a much longer life cycle. So I think those products need to be designed with that in mind, so that maybe it is a display, you can replace the display and you can get the next generation of that display without necessarily having to replace your entire fridge, because that's not something you normally would be doing. And then it is a little bit more of a sustainable life cycle for that product. Right now, there isn't that much thought put into those kind of questions, but I do hope that it's something, you know, we have some way to influence over time with our customers.
Thanks, well said. I'm just recalling, I don't know if it's a myth or if it's actually true, but like these first Tesla cars had basically more cameras than the software could support. Mm-hmm. And just over OT updates, and later they basically were able to work with these extra cameras and then makes the self-driving experience basically even more safer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, kind of anticipating what will happen over time by adding certain support in the hardware. There are a few examples of that. Tesla's one good example of that. I think, you know, the Nest products had certain support in them ahead of time, and then later added support in the software. There's a few other ones that don't immediately come to mind. And then the other piece is the ability to retrofit products over time, right? So maybe to go back to that fridge example, over time you may be able to add more cameras in the fridge once the company has more support for, you know, computer vision to be able to recognize what you have in your fridge and order things you don't have in your fridge, or suggest recipes that you may want to use with the things you have in your fridge, right? Like, it doesn't have to be that you roll out that fridge with that many cameras, or, you know, like that, those particular types of support. And as long as you can figure out how things can be retrofitted over time to support more functionality, that's also a good path.
Thank you. We have a question here from LinkedIn now. Zara, I think it's her name pronounced. It's a little bit longer. Let me start reading. I've also experienced a challenge when it comes to usability testing versus how people actually use the product. Are there any tips you have to mitigate this in upfront product research? Let's go with this question first and do the follow-up question afterwards.
Yeah, so not so much in usability testing, because I really think that for usability testing, you really need to observe how users use the product. I don't think there is a shortcut for looking at interaction data directly when real users use the product. But I would say that in product research, upfront product research, before you launch something, before you launch the product, or before you launch the feature, we actually have in our product something that allows users, or our users, hardware companies, to research App Store reviews and get kind of very distilled summaries of common feature requests, or how users discuss certain features, and you get an understanding of common complaints, because then it is users that are discussing the types of features they're thinking of rolling out, but in the context of already having used them. So yes, it is still users saying something as opposed to doing something, but at least in that context, they're saying something about the feature they've already experienced as opposed to just talking about it in the abstract. So it's a little bit more closer to the truth than just surveying users. Great question.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that question, then we go over here again in Zoom. So she also said like, maybe some methodologies that you tried and tested to get users out of the lab environment. So maybe you share some of these methodologies, you did this. But one thing they have tried, for example, is to get users to do the same action multiple times to see if it impacts their impression of UX. Maybe there are some other tips and methods you can have. Is this something you also recommend, for example?
Yeah, I think it's actually a little bit tricky to get users to do things multiple times, because the second time a user does something, they've already learned how it works. And so it's a slightly different, you're getting a slightly different metric where ideally the product has already educated user, to get back to user education on what's going on. And so then you don't have that clear of a data point on what happens when a user sees this feature for the first time. Do they immediately know how to use it, and can they immediately spot it on the screen, and that kind of stuff. I think, yeah, I guess I think the best way is really just to get users using the product. And you don't have to launch the feature to every user, right? Like you can also launch it to a subset of users and observe how those users are interacting with the product. Of course, you know, the other type of way of doing that is to do A/B testing, but of course you need to have a very large user base to be able to get statistically significant data on how users are able to interact with the feature. So I would say that that's probably even one more step removed from there.
Thank you. Marv, if you want to unmute yourself to ask the question directly, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. It's good to see everyone from the Product People team here again. Hi, my name is Marv, product manager, 6 years and going on 7. I just have a quick question. One, just for clarification, I feel like I kind of missed that when you were speaking. So when you're talking about improving experience, you're primarily talking about the application of the product, or also the actual hardware and how it's built and things like this, or is it both, or just one of these things?
It is.
So that's my first question. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. No, go ahead. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought you were going to do both of them. Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah. So so for most connected devices, usually the way users interact with the hardware is via the application or a display. I'm sort of, pointing to the Peloton behind me, right? So for most of the interaction is going to come from there. There may be some situations where the product has some other type of UX to it, like that light bulb example that blinks, right? Like the blinking is the UX that tells us that the light bulb has been disconnected. I think that too, you will be able to learn from how users then interact with the app. So for most part, ultimately, most of the user experience for a connected device comes from how users interact with the app or display that controls it. And that's the pieces that we focus on. We focus less on kind of the connectivity itself, right? Like, is it how reliable is the device to connect to the internet, assuming it's not a Bluetooth device, in which case you're already connecting it to the app. So that's, there are folks focusing on that specific problem and are doing that pretty well as it is right now.
Okay. In that case, then, just to follow up on that, so you said that not many people are actually using analytics to solve, like problems of experience, right? And you also mentioned big players. So are we also talking about companies like Nest and what's the Amazon company called?
Ring?
Yes, yeah, Ring and things like that.
Yes.
Like
Yeah,
also
those are the exception. They do use analytics. However, I would say that, and I haven't looked at their history specifically for like when they started using analytics. I would not be surprised if they started using analytics in product development much later than your traditional like software startup, because even with folks like not to continue talking about Peloton, but it's literally in my view, so it's a easy example for me to think of. They started using analytics directly and built up an analytics team and that kind of stuff much later than you would expect to see in kind of pure software contexts. After having lots of devices out in the field, after having lots and lots of users, that's when they started creating dashboards and analytics teams focusing on that. So I think you see that there's sort of like a lag in connected hardware across the board, even if there's definitely a few leaders that are currently using analytics.
Okay, got it. And just a final one, unless there's a bunch of questions. Okay. So IoT, would you define that as like always being like a hardware component there?
No, I would not actually. It's a great question. I think we're starting to see a lot of, it really depends on how you define hardware, but definitely not consumer electronics. So we're starting to see a lot of things that aren't traditionally, would traditionally not be considered consumer electronics getting connected. Things like furniture, doors, toys, clothing, right? There's a lot of different toothbrush. Well, actually, those are consumer electronics. But there's a lot of different things around us that are starting to become connected, that are connected things, but not necessarily connected hardware per se.
No, I mean like things as in like even like physical objects. Like for example, would you consider like a service within the Web3? Like basically what I'm trying to say is, what's your definition of IoT? Because sometimes I see a service within the world of, like everything's now beginning to talk about, like Web 3.0 and all this, and the potential of Web 3.0 and having all these data points, interconnected in this virtual world. Is this also considered in your definition as IoT? Or does
not in my definition? I'm sure there are folks who would disagree with me. I would say that my definition of IoT is something in the physical space is getting internet connected. And that's now Internet of Things, Internet of Physical Things.
Okay.
My specific definition. It'd be interesting. I'd love to hear other perspectives on that.
Okay, sure. Then I'll ping you on that. All right. So thank you guys, and thanks for answering my questions. Cheers.
Thanks. Great questions.
Thanks, Marv. I think we are nearly at the end of questions. I have here also one follow-up question to you, Yana. Is it seeing hardware companies working with software teams inside, is there also maybe an issue with the development or the product development lifecycle of hardware and software, that software comes far too late, basically?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think there's a lot of that, right? Because you have hardware that gets planned years ahead, takes years, doesn't get updated for years after the fact. And then you have software moving much faster, and sometimes so fast that people feel like, okay, well, software we can add at the very, very end, because we need to do all of this planning on hardware. And then as you get towards the end of that, suddenly you realize, oh, we actually have no user experience at all to go with this product, but we can just get someone either internally or like hire an agency to do it. And I think that's usually where some of these issues come into play as well. It's just that hasn't been part of the whole design process from the start. It becomes more of an afterthought, and a very rushed afterthought. I think that's actually, one type of problem as well that we've seen.
Oh, thank you very much. Then I would say I give 5 seconds, very short 5 seconds to the audience to throw the very last question in. Otherwise, I have a question to you. How did you enjoy this talk today?
I very much enjoyed it. Lots of really interesting questions. Excited to be speaking across the pond, or across the world. It's a lovely morning here in San Francisco, and I think you guys have been thinking about things all day, which is a different mindset altogether. But yeah, really enjoyed calling in to this and connecting with the product people community. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much for being with us today. And with that, thank you also, community. As I said, this session got recorded and will be live soonish. Join us for next events at Product Management People, at Telegram, but also on Patreon. And you also can find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and co. Follow us for next events or fun facts about product management. Again, Yana, thanks for joining. And with that, we leave the audience into, in German we call Feierabend, and on the West Coast we say good morning and start in the day. Thank you.